Okay, if everybody could take their seats, we're going to head on in now to the plenary session and the final session of the day. My name is Sarah Gearty, for anybody who doesn't know. I'm the cartographic and managing editor with the Atlas Project here in the Royal Irish Academy. Okay, so the plenary session today is dedicated to the city of Belfast, and it's also dedicated to the late Professor Raymond Gillespie, who was a member of the Royal Irish Academy and also a long-term member of our editorial board in the Atlas. And Raymond died last year. We were all very sad to lose him, and I know he was a friend and colleague of many in this room. But when we were planning the seminar, and we sent out a call for papers, and thanks to all of you who responded, and as you know, we've had a great day of papers and a great variety on the topic of water. But two papers came back about Belfast, and there was interest in Belfast from two directions. And at first it seemed sort of fortuitous, and then, you know, immediately, of course, it's unsurprising because you read a bit deeper, and there were both discussions, thoughts that had been discussed with Raymond at different times. So it seemed fitting that we hold a plenary on Belfast and dedicate it to Raymond, who I hope would approve of that. So here we are. We have two speakers. Professor Keith Lilley, where is he? Oh, there he is. Thought he had taken advantage of the comfort break and escaped us. So we're delighted to have Keith here today. He's a historical geographer known to many here from Queen's University Belfast, with particular research expertise in interpreting historic landscapes, maps and built environments. And Keith is a real friend to our project. He was chair of the British Historic Towns Atlas for many years, and indeed convened this seminar with us for many years. So he's no stranger, and we're looking forward very much to what he has to say in the first part of our plenary on a watery tale, mapping medieval Belfast.
Very much, Sarah. Thank you, everybody, for staying the course. It's a watery metaphor. Staying the course and heading north. So I'm taking us north. I'm also going to be taking us back in time, as you can probably tell from the title. And I thought it might be appropriate to begin with some words, actually, from Raymond. From many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with this Belfast circa 1600 to 1900. Booklet with a pocket map, which you can use to wander around Belfast when you come and visit. And in it, there's a little essay. And I just thought I'd start off with some words, which is actually by Raymond Gillespie and Steve Royal, who you'll hear about in a moment. So I should put my reading glasses on, really. So what they say is, to a contemporary observer, Belfast appears as a 19th or early 20th century industrial town, a view reinforced by its popular perception as a centre of shipbuilding and linen manufacture. Yet, behind this, there is an older history of which there is little trace in the modern city. And it's this trace of medieval Belfast that I want us to be looking at today, to explore through mapping. And the idea then is to go back before circa 1600 and to retrace the medieval origins of what is now the city of Belfast. So I do that with some trepidation, to be honest, because as we've heard today from the programme, there's a huge amount of expertise around our towns and cities. And as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm a blow-in, although I've been in Belfast now for 25 years, so I've been there a long time. But I've recently, I've made most of my work in the past has really been about looking at medieval towns and cities. And one of the impacts of the pandemic, I think there's not many good things that came out of the pandemic, to be honest, but one of the things that did come out of it, which possibly was a good thing, was to look local, to discover the heritage on our doorstep, to stop travelling hither and thither like I did as an academic from one place to another place before 2020, and to spend a little bit of time actually looking at what we have on our doorsteps. So what I have to talk to you about really this afternoon is in part a reflection of that, sort of standing still, looking, thinking, and picking up on what I knew Raymond and Steve were working on, or had worked on, in terms of the Irish Historic Towns Atlas Volume 1, which we'll see in a minute, of Belfast, the first fascicule of Belfast. And it was a conversation that I had with Raymond in December 23 here at the Academy, and I had begun to sort of think a little bit about mapping medieval Belfast. As a geographer, we like maps and mapping. And I was keen to get his insights on this. You know, he's the man, he's the expert on this. So that's really what brings me here, actually, is that conversation. And I want to sort of unveil, really, or reveal some of the consequences of what I've been doing since 2023. Of course, Raymond was one of the two authors of the first Irish Historic Towns Atlas of Belfast, which I think is available out there to purchase, covering the period to 1840. And he did that in collaboration with my colleague at Queen's, Steve Royle. While Steve was around, while I was working at Queen's about 10 or 15 years ago, we had a cartographer, they're very rare these days, but very valuable, called Maura Pringle. And Maura Pringle was working hard for Steve and for Raymond on this particular map. She's very pleased with it. It's a growth phase map showing how Belfast has developed over time. We saw the equivalent one for Dublin earlier on. Belfast map 12, this map is a map I use a lot in my teaching at Queen's. I use it not only because it neatly captures the spatial growth of Belfast over time, as you can see from different colours. It shows how we can use historic maps as sources from which to map urban development. And for Belfast, we're fortunate in having a series of topographic maps spanning the late 17th to the 19th centuries. So what you'll see here, each different colour on the phase map shows a new area of Belfast as revealed by mapping a sequence of historic maps, a neat thing to do. But this is fine if you're working from the earliest historic maps from the 17th century. But what if you want to look before the first historic maps of the 17th century in the case of Belfast? What then? There is, as we can see here, no colour on the map to identify medieval or pre-plantation Belfast. For Armagh's Irish Historic Towns Atlas, in contrast, the medieval urban core is coloured pink on map 9, labelled as pre-1600s, as you can see here. Oh, that was my phone. And for Derry, Irish Historic Towns Atlas map 21 has each probable medieval site shown in green. So it's this absence of Belfast's medieval presence on map 12 that roused my curiosity and lies behind my paper this evening. Mapping medieval Belfast poses some intellectual challenges and risks. I'm by no means the first to search for it. Archaeologists and historians have long sought to identify and locate it. The most recent archaeological research on Belfast has, however, continued to draw something of a blank, as excavations have yielded little medieval material, let alone structures. For example, in his 2011 book, Hidden History Below Our Feet, Belfast archaeologist Rory O'Boyle notes, and I quote, "So far, no evidence for the houses in the medieval settlement for Belfast has been uncovered." Earlier, 5 years earlier in 2006, in the Ulster Journal of Archaeology, two papers, one by John O'Keefe and another by Philip MacDonald, summarised the historical problem and the medieval archaeological evidence for medieval Belfast. MacDonald reflected, another quote, "It is perhaps surprising that the excavations conducted to date in the area of central Belfast, which has been identified as the likely position of any medieval settlements, have not produced more evidence of medieval activity in settlements." So there is something of an enigma, therefore. It is this enigmatic absence of medieval Belfast that lies behind my title, A Watery Tale. It's like water, fluid and slippery, The medieval origins of modern-day Belfast are difficult to grasp. Yet at the same time, it's water, as we've been hearing a lot about today, that seems to hold a clue to medieval Belfast's past and also its location. So most histories of early Belfast cite two key important pieces of evidence. One is the place name, and the other is a reference in an Inquisition post-mortem of 1333. And let us look at the second first. So with a killing of William de Burgo, Earl of Ulster, we have a detailed inquisition of lands he held, including this one, at Leford, a manor in which there was a castle, now thrown down by John de Logan's war, and worth nothing. There was a borough town, now all burnt and destroyed by the said John, and worth nothing at present. The mention of Leford has led modern historians to assume this is a reference to a ford of the Lagan, and hence locate the borough town in an area somewhere around Ann Street and High Street, as shown by Rory O'Boyle's map, itself based on the Irish Historic Towns Atlas Belfast, fascicule number 1, figure 2. This takes us then to the place name of Belfast, which is not as straightforward as first appears. The Irish Historic Towns Atlas notes the name means mouth or ford of the sandbank. And the most satisfactory translation is probably, quote, approach to the tidal ford. There is, of course, a river Farset which flows into the Lagan, and on which the later 17th century town under Sir Arthur Chichester was sited. And this is the pink area shown on IHTA map 12, the extent of the town in 1685, which you can see here on the screen. But let us pause for a moment. What if Leford relates to the Farset, not the Lagan, but the Farset, because it too needed fording, like the Lagan. There is an as yet unexplored piece of evidence that would seem to support this and place medieval Belfast not at what became Ann Street, but instead to the west on the Farset itself. The missing evidence I propose here is not archaeological or documentary, but cartographic and morphological. And this was the suggestion I outlined to Raymond back in December 2023. The earliest maps of Belfast to show details of the urban landscape are by Thomas Phillips, circa 1635 to 93, the maps dating to 1685. And these two maps offer a tantalizing trace of what I think is medieval Belfast, still then tangible. And to understand this means looking at Phillips's maps morphologically, not just cartographically, looking at the shape of streets and plot patterns that are visible on the maps. Our own Sarah Gearty has written on Phillips, a British military engineer, and his maps of Ireland. And for Belfast, there are two similar looking maps, one with buildings shown axonometrically, so like in 3 dimensions, which is this one here. The buildings are shown axonometrically in 3 dimensions, as you can see in perspective, but the streets on the map are shown planimetrically, that is to say in 2 dimensions, vertically, looking straight down onto the landscape. The other map we have of Phillips for Belfast has the streets and buildings shown in plan only. So just note on this map that south is at the top. It takes you a little while just to turn your head upside down to get a sense of it. But you can see the Lagan is on the left-hand side over there. So we're looking south at the top of the map, whereas the planimetric map is the opposite. Okay, so north is at the top and the Lagan is now on the right-hand side, as you can see there. Both maps include an outline of an unbuilt star-shaped fort on the banks of the Lagan. I don't know if I can make this work. Is it like a pointy thing? Oh, doesn't matter. never mind. You can I point on the banks of the Lagan, you can see the sort of star-shaped forts. And the axonometric plan actually, if we just go back, includes the line of an unbuilt and ambitious circuit of defences linking to the forts. Very faint on here, but you'll see it in due course, encompassing Belfast completely. I don't think much has been written on either of those, actually, the star-shaped fort or the wider circuit of defences, unbuilt. Now, what's new here is some work that I've been doing with one of my PhD students. So here's the two star-shaped forts for you side by side. See, I was prepared, well, more than I thought I was. So there's two star-shaped forts on the right-hand side from the planimetric, and from the left-hand side there, the axonometric. Okay. A PhD student of mine, Dia Banerjee, has been helping me quite a lot with creating a new GIS for Belfast. Again, amazingly, we don't have such a thing, to my knowledge. Using a geographic information system, a GIS, we can begin to compare the maps of Phillips, the two maps. And when we do that, what we find is, firstly, that this is a GIS screenshot, that the maps, the street pattern of each closely matches. So these are the two Phillips plans overlaid one on top of the other in the GIS. One made slightly transparent so we can see through it. You can see the star-shaped fort is positioned in slightly different places on each of those. Not only is the street pattern of each matching, so it's a very close correspondence between the two Phillips maps, they're also both spatially accurate. Within a geographic information system, we can georeference these maps, and they match up very closely with the street layouts of modern day Belfast. And we can see that if we make one of those maps slightly transparent and juxtapose it against a modern street plan. Now, this geospatial accuracy has to be caveated, as we've been hearing about already, because Phillips's maps are not only representations of what was there on the grounds in 1685, but also what might be built in the future. Of course, the fort and the fortifications. Looking closely at the features of the maps, there are some aspects that caught my eye as a medievalist. Somebody interested in medieval urban morphology, the shape of towns and cities in the Middle Ages. The first of those features is the bridge, shown on the axonometric plan as destroyed, which is offset from and on a different alignment to the streets of Chichester's Belfast, the plantation town, namely Ann Street, High Street and Waring Street. Why so? The old bridge and perhaps fording point of the Lagan instead lines up with Castle Street to the west. You see where that blue line heads. Chichester's castle, Phillips's map shows, is assumed by archaeologists and by historians to be on the same site as the castle referred to in 1333. But as MacDonald notes that the Anglo-Norman castle was located on the same site as the later Gaelic Tower House is an assumption. And besides, this site would be unsuited to a construction such as a motte type of castle due to the immediate ground conditions of sleech in Belfast and muddy silt. There is another feature on Phillips's maps that also has an appearance of a defensive structure, and this lies to the far west of Castle Street, close to the Farset, a bit where I put in there medieval settlement of Ford on the map. With two circular bastions overlooking the crossing point of the Farset River, could this structure reflect the site of the medieval castle? Well, yes, I think it could. Moreover, close by, Phillips shows a series of plots with buildings fronting onto an open space beside the river bridge, and approaching from the northwest is a causeway, and from the south another road from the Malone Ridge. And this focal point seems to be a strategic crossing of the Farset, the road leading from here to the east towards the Lagan, which lines up with the old bridge that Phillips's map shows. And it's on this junction where I've written medieval settlement of Ford. It's on this junction that a map of 1696 contains the words market. Could this location, the crossing of the Farset, be Le Ford, referred to in 1333, and if so, the site of the borough town? The account of Le Ford refers not just to a castle, but to a mill, and Phillips shows here a mill pond created by damming the Farset. But perhaps the most compelling evidence that this area represents an early settlement is morphological. Phillips's two maps both show the then defences of the plantation town slicing Castle Street in half which you can see I've written on the map there, and running across and through a series of plots fronting onto the south side of the street, and on the north side of the street was the channel of the river, the Farset. Looking at the map here, this wide and long street running east-west, looking at the map here, this wide and long street running east-west on either side of the defences has similar morphological characteristics in terms of its alignment, its width, and its plot pattern. The defences appear to be superimposed upon it, so the later defences are here in red, which is why the street and plots on either side of the defences look so similar. The street and its plots must predate the defences. It's a principle of topographical stratigraphy that gives us a terminus ante quem for an underlying feature, in this case, Castle Street. So let's summarise. What we seem to be seeing here on Phillips's maps is a settlement at the crossing of the Farset, accompanied by a defensive structure, plot patterns, and a long and broad street, itself containing what appears to be infill development along its length. And tracing this street eastward, it aligns with the crossing of the Lagan. And also, and also at its eastern end, a structure shown by Phillips as a tower, which I ringed here in red. Later, the site of the market house at Corn Market, but conceivably, looking at the symbol here, a former church or chapel. References in the early 14th century to Capella de Vado, the chapel of the ford, have long been known, but usually the chapel is said to be on the site later occupied by St. George's Church, further along the road, at the east end of High Street. But if so, it would seem odd that the location is not actually by the crossing of here it is in yellow, the place I'm thinking is the Chapel of the Ford. It would seem odd that the location is not actually by the crossing of the Lagan. Looking at the area as it was before Chichester's town was plotted out in good form, as the plantation commissioners had observed in 1611, is again possible through a close reading of Phillips's maps. The later town is clearly laid out on a large flat area reclaimed from the sleechy banks of the Lagan. And this is noted on the map itself with the words, as you can probably read here, improvement made upon the strand, and included creating the new cut river to help with drainage. Before this reclamation, the edge of the tidal part of the Lagan would have been further west. Indeed, reference in 1597 places the later, the early modern castle's position, I quote, on the river, where the sea ebbs and flows, so that boats may be landed within a butt shot of the said castle. So I've tried to ring that in red here. This suggests this location was then intertidal. A small yet important other feature on Phillips's map to the north also hints at the former edge of the tidal zone of the Lagan, and this is a sinuous plot boundary, which is again highlighted here, which is at odds with the regular forms of streets and plots in the same area, as you can see looking at the map. It runs towards the end of Castle Street to the edge of the later castle location, and to the south of the castle, where the former banks of the Lagan before reclamation took place, are clear to see. Even before Chichester, reclamation of this tidal area as a site for a new town for occupation and settlement seems to have been in the mind of Walter Devereux, Earl of Essex, when he wrote in November 1573, near unto Belfast is a place meet suitable for a corporate town. And then he goes on, I won't read the whole quotation. I desire that Lythe, the engineer, or some other skillful in fortifications should be sent hither, who shall also build a bridge upon the Lagan without her majesty's charge. And it's this same Robert Lythe, the cartographer, the map maker, whose map of Belfast Lough of 1570 thereabouts marks the location of Belfast, which is in ring in red, isolated as if a greenfield site. So perhaps it should be no surprise that the urban archaeology of medieval Belfast has been so elusive in the area of Chichester's town. It simply wasn't there. It's the wrong place. It looks much more likely that this area is laid out on reclaimed land, pushing 17th century Belfast closer to and into the Lagan, ringed in red here. And this left the earlier medieval settlements in orange higher and drier, somewhat marginalised, a peripherality reinforced when it was further cut off by the later town defences, picked out in the red line there. This line of the town defences on Phillips's maps of 1685 are assumed to be of the Confederate wars of the 1640s. Indeed, there is reference then to work taking place on about the rampier, about the ramparts. The circuit overall appears incomplete. There's a gap between Strand Gate and North Gate, which I picked out with those red lines, and a section on Phillips's maps labelled the Old Works in 1685. There are earlier references to defences too at Belfast in the 16th century, including the Earl of Essex's day, as well as before that under the O'Neills. Indeed, the 4 circular bastions picked out in blue here, the 4 circular bastions evident on Phillips's maps at the later Belfast Castle, as well as the suggested site of Ford, together might have formed an earlier defensive alignment to the south, parallel to and south of Castle Street. So there's clearly much work still to do with mapping medieval Belfast, as you can see, and to uncover its watery tales. This time is against me this afternoon, as we've just seen. I've only got 5 minutes left in going any further at this stage. But there's more to say, much more to say and learn from looking again at historic maps of our towns and cities. Although these maps, like Phillips's, do, of course, post-date the medieval period by some centuries, the image of the urban landscape they present is one that reaches further back in time, as I hope I've shown. Fossilizing urban forms, these later maps, when interpreted morphologically, enable us to identify earlier features, as we've just been doing with Belfast. So this is my suggestion then for medieval Belfast. It was there, it did exist, but it's not under the Chichester town, it's further to the west. The Chichester town is laid out where it says intertidal area. Doing this for other places begins to indicate that the layout of medieval Belfast, laid out along one bank of the Farset, so not the Lagan, but it's laid out on the Farset River, which you can see there, where the mill pond is. If you run your eye to the south of that, you'll pick out the blue line, and that's the Farset running alongside the street, what becomes Castle Street, and then exiting into the Sleech. So we can find other examples of this elsewhere in northern counties. So in Coleraine, for example, the striking plan by Thomas Raven of 1622 naturally draws our eye to the new town, as it was then, on the east banks of the Bann. But to the west on the map here, we see the remnants of an earlier medieval town with a castle at one end of a long street running parallel to the Bann, with a church at the opposite end, a model which is very much like what we've just been seeing with Ford and Belfast. Geographically closer to Belfast at Newton Ards, a place that was comprehensively replanned after the 1770s, the medieval new town of Blathwick or Blathwick appears to be fossilised on a map of 1722, as you can see here. And here the long axis of High Street and Castle Street are fronted by a series of plots, which I hope you can see, stretching back on the south side, that's this side, my side, to the shore of Strangford Lough, which is just off the map. We see something similar in the street plan of Newry, a town like Belfast later extended. So it's the area I've identified there with the yellow dashed line, is these linear settlements along the river. Moving to Dundalk, the area of Seatown appears to be the earliest of the 12th century, laid out on the shores of the water of Athlone. And indeed, we see similarly elsewhere at Carlingford and also Carrickfergus. And this again is the advantage of the Irish Historic Towns Atlas in giving us these maps to project and compare side by side, where the medieval town streets run parallel to the loch shore, which I've identified with a red circle. All these medieval towns seem to share something in common: the creation of linear plans laid out in parallel to a river or loch. As at Belfast, the watery influence on medieval urban form seems to be a strong one. A more comparative cartographic and morphological study is needed to explore this connection. It's a shared plan that I think is distinctive, at least in layouts of some towns in the Fief of Ulster. But how far this model of medieval urbanism applies elsewhere in Ireland and beyond is, I think, something we need to look into further. I'm sure Raymond would have approved. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Keith. And I'm sure Raymond would have approved. He was always one for big ideas, and this idea of moving Belfast or playing around with that and looking into the morphology. I remember when we were working on the Charles Breck book years ago, he just loved looking into the detail of plots, not what you would have associated with Raymond, but he was one for looking at plots in that way as well. So, and it's fascinating. We've had a lot of that today. You know, we began the day with Clonmines, this idea of looking at towns through water, and, you know, whether they still exist or for us today as well. But I think that's one of the things about the water remains, or the rivers remain, and then the towns kind of shift around that. So it's a very, very great way of looking at it. So thank you, Keith, for that. And we'll come back to it, I'm sure, in the questions. But for now, we're going to move on in time. We're going to stay with Belfast. And we're going to move on to our next. This is a double header. So if I can introduce Dr. Jonathan Wright, who has done lots of work on Belfast. He's an historian based in the Department of History in Maynooth University, and he's also a member of our editorial board, so a Towns Atlas man himself. So, Jonathan.
Hey, thanks, Sarah. It's a great pleasure to be able to contribute to today, and particularly in this panel in honour of Raymond, a friend and colleague to so many of us. I would agree completely with what Sarah said. I think that Raymond very much would have approved of the watery tale that Keith has just told us. I can't say with as much confidence that he would approve of what I'm going to say. And when I was preparing this, I have to say I felt his absence quite keenly. It was great working in Maynooth, working on a paper like this. You could go into his office and say, oh, I'm working on docks and such like in Belfast, and Ray would say invariably, well, what you want to do is, or even better, what you want to look at, and he would then ream off a whole series of references, 2 or 3 of which you might have come across before, but the vast majority of which you wouldn't have occurred to look at. I didn't have that benefit when I was preparing this. So from the watery story of medieval Belfast, which Keith has explored so suggestively for us, I'm going to take us forward now to the second half of the 18th century, by which point Belfast had taken on a recognisable form that we can still trace in the streetscape of the modern town. Water was, of course, central to Belfast's developments. The town is, or city as it is now, is situated on the banks of the River Lagan, where it flows into Belfast Lough. But more particularly, it developed in the early 17th century. It developed in the early 17th century at the point where a second river, which Keith has referred to, the River Farset, joins the River Lagan, and a third river, the Blackstaff River, lay a short distance to the south. So I've ringed the Blackstaff on the map, and if you just kind of look north, you'll see a second red ring in the built-up area at the foot of High Street, which is where in the 17th and the 18th, late 18th century, this map dates from the River Farset flowed into the Lagan. Now, this watery topography had obvious benefits, but it also concealed the roots of future problems. The town, particularly around High Street, was prone to flooding in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and the Blackstaff River would become synonymous by the middle of the 19th century with pollution, disease, and unsanitary living conditions. Much ink would be spilt by 19th century commentators on what they termed, with quaint Victorian propriety, the Blackstaff nuisance. In the late 18th century, which is depicted in this map, the unsanitary horrors of the mid-19th century Blackstaff lay in the future. The population of Belfast stood at just over 18,000. And as you can see from this 1791 map, James Williamson's map, its streetscape remained relatively compact, the southern boundary being marked by the White Linen Hall, which you can see here. For those of you who are familiar with Belfast or who visited, you will know presumably where today's Belfast City Hall is. And Belfast City Hall sits exactly on the site of the old White Linen Hall. So that marked the southern terminus of Belfast in the late 18th century. And while I'm sort of giving you your kind of modern bearings, so you can kind of orientate yourself in relation to what I'm talking about this afternoon, let me show you another modern landmark, which is the Big Fish. Some of you, if you visit Belfast, this is a kind of I won't say a tourist attraction because it's not particularly attractive, it must be said, but people go and get their photo taken there quite unpleasantly. It's rumoured in Belfast that drunks on a Friday and Saturday night would leave themselves on the Big Fish and tourists appear the following morning to get their photo taken beside it. Why I'm putting this up is because the area that I'm talking about, Belfast kind of dockland, if you like, its maritime world in the late 18th century was basically exactly where this is, running north and south of where the Big Fish sits, overlooking the River Lagan today. Now, visitors to the town in the late 18th century couldn't get their photo taken beside the Big Fish, but they did pass their judgments on what they found. And their judgments on Belfast varied. What the Duke of Rutland considered in 1787 to be a giant of a town, flourishing in everything, the American merchant James Whatmore had 2 years earlier described as dirty, disagreeable, and unremarkable. Belfast, he wrote in a letter to his wife in November 1785, is without exception the most filthy, dirty place I ever was in. The streets are paved, but I had rather walk through the deep clay of Wilmington than in the street of this abominable, filthy place. One thing, however, that visitors to Belfast did agree on was its importance as a centre of trade. Writing in 1759, Edward Wills, the Earl of Warwick, noted that Belfast is a seaport and has a great trade. There are, he continued, many merchants and traders of substance. It seems to me to be the London of the north of Ireland. In 1787, the Duke of Rutland observed that Belfast's trade was immense and that its merchants, as he put it, go to the West Indies and to almost every quarter of the globe. And even the curmudgeonly James Whatmore conceded that Belfast, if abominable filthy, was nevertheless a place of considerable trade. Considerable trade, however, required considerable infrastructure, both bureaucratic in the form of a customs house and maritime in the form of docks and quaysides, moorings and wharfs. On these aspects, visitors to Belfast in the late 18th century had very little to say, and indeed I found only 2 relevant references. In his account of his Irish tour of 1792, recently edited and published by Christopher Woods, Charles Abbott observed that Belfast's quay and custom house, as he put it, are neither large nor handsome, and that the town possessed no docks for repairing ships. In a similar vein, in his 1787 journal, the clergyman and cartographer Daniel Augustus Beaufort noted that Belfast's quay was not so large as I expected. He was equally unimpressed by the quay at Sligo, but, and it's mortifying as a proud Belfast man to report this, was notably positive about the broad and convenient quay he had encountered in Derry. But if Belfast's quaysides and docks appeared unimpressive to visitors, they were no less significant for that. Abbott noted in 1792 that somewhere in the region of 80 ships now belong to the port of Belfast, and that its annual port and excise duties are around £100,000 a year. By the early years of the 19th century, the town was trading extensively with the West Indies and North America, and in 1810 the Belfast Newsletter was printing figures suggesting that Belfast alone was responsible for around 1/6 of the trade of all of Ireland. Unimpressive as they might have appeared to visitors, It was Belfast's docks and quaysides that facilitated all of this. They were, in a sense, the engine that powered the town's growth and expansion in the 18th century, a gateway that connected it to the wider Atlantic world and its networks of trade and exchange. So given all of this, it occurred to me some time ago that it might be worth taking a slightly closer look at Belfast's quays and docks, its maritime world. And needless to say, I'm by no means the first person to consider this. Aspects of the history of Belfast docks have been discussed in the work of the great 19th century historian of the town, George Ben, in that of his 20th century successor, DJ Owen. Focused histories have been written by Robin Sweetnam and Alf McCreary, and most significantly, given the current context, the early development of Belfast quays attracted the attention of a certain Raymond Gillespie. Having what you think of as a good idea, only to discover that Raymond has beaten you to it, is of course a regular experience for anyone who works on early modern Belfast or early modern Ireland. Now, as regards Belfast quays, in the 2015-16 issue of the newsletter of the Group for the Study of Irish Historic Settlement, Raymond published a short piece detailing what he described as a micro-topography of Belfast quays, tracing their development from the early 17th century up to really the start of the 18th century, when two quays known in the early 18th century and George's Quay and Merchant's Quay had developed on the banks of the Farset River where it met the Lygon. The evidence is limited, but Raymond suggested that these had developed sort of sporadically over the course of the 17th century, and that their development had been hampered by the particular phrasing of Belfast's charter, which gave the sovereign free burgesses and commonality of the town the right to establish a quay, but not the means to provide for its upkeep. And as we'll see, private enterprise would become essential to the development of the maritime quarter of Belfast in the 18th century. Now, the best image that we have of Belfast as it was in the late 17th century is John Phillips' map of 1685, which Keith has already explored so suggestively. This depicts the major features of the town: the castle, St. George's Church, its defensive ramparts, and also what we could suppose describe as an imagined future for the town in the form of expanded defensive works and the defensive citadel, which you can see circled here, and Keith, of course, has already talked about this. Projecting into Belfast Lough to the northeast of Belfast, this defensive citadel was well placed to defend and protect the town from naval predation. Or rather, it would have been well placed because in reality, the citadel, like the extended ramparts, never came to pass. Phillips was, in a sense, using his imagination here, projecting a future for the town. But it isn't only here, I think, where Phillips was using his imagination. His 1685 map also depicts ships entering the Farset River from the River Lygon, as you can see on this slide here. This is all very picturesque, and the ships entering the Farset serve to illustrate the presence of the town's quays, but it seems highly unlikely that vessels of the size that Phillips was actually depicting here could ever have moored at those quays, because the waters at the mouth of the Farset were notoriously shallow. What you can see here is a 1757 map of Belfast, which can be found in the Linen Hall Library and which is reproduced in the Belfast Part 1 Atlas Fascicle. It's not a particularly detailed map, although it does contain markings for a quay and a dock. But more interesting is the text in the bottom left-hand corner, which records, it's very faded, but it records that this town, for vessels of any considerable burden, is of very difficult access by reason of the shaleness or shallowness of the water and intricacy of the channel between it and the road of Goremoyle. So larger ships approaching Belfast in the 17th and 18th centuries could not access the quaysides themselves. they had to drop anchor at the Pool of Garmoil and transport their goods to Belfast on smaller lighters or gabbarts. And you can see Garmoil mapped in the red circle on this 1789 map, which was prepared by James Lawson for Belfast's landlord, the Earl of Donegal. Donegal appears at the time to have been contemplating harbour improvements for Belfast. And this map details, well, not quite the lie of the land, but the lie, if you like, of the channels leading from Belfast Lough to Belfast. So these are the snaking channels that you can see here in the circle. And what Lawson also does on this map is he marks the shallowness of the water in these channels as it's approaching Belfast. 2.5 foot, 3 foot, 4.5 foot. So the navigational difficulties that this would have presented to shipping as it approached Belfast are fairly readily understandable, but they are vividly illustrated in a journal kept by a woman called Harriet Skeffington in the fateful month of June 1798. Skeffington's husband, Chichester Skeffington, was a member of the Belfast Yeomanry, and as the political climate deteriorated and the United Irishmen embarked in open rebellion, Chichester Skeffington decided it would be prudent to get his wife safely offside. This proved easier said than done. On the 9th of June, Harriet Skeffington boarded a coal ship bound for Scotland with 50 other fearful women and children. They bedded down for the night, no doubt dreaming of safety in Scotland, but woke in the morning of the 10th of June to discover that they had gone precisely nowhere. They had in fact been run aground by what Skeffington describes in her journal as an unskillful pilot. They were quite literally sitting ducks. All but 2 of the crew had abandoned ship, and it was not, in fact, until the morning of the 11th of June that they made it safely to sea. Now, if Lawson's 1789 map reveals the particular challenges of the tidal waterway connecting Belfast to the wider world, it is decidedly vague, both in the main map and in the inset street plan on Belfast's quays and docks. There's no real detail given, although the inset does mark out the location of the custom house. For a more detailed representation of Belfast's maritime infrastructure, we need to jump forward to a later map produced in 1822 for George Benn's History of the Town of Belfast, which was published in 1823. The map was drawn in 1822 and the book was published in 1823. Now, as you can see, this is a map of a rapidly expanding streetscape, a town which was spreading out in all directions beyond its 18th century boundaries. But what is of particular interest here, of course, is the depiction of what now begins to appear as a distinctive maritime quarter with all the quays and docks, graving docks and shipyards clearly marked on it. Some of what's depicted here was of relatively recent origin. Donegal Quay, for instance, or what is labelled as Donegal Quay here, was constructed around 1804. The shipyards and graving docks that lie to the north were relatively new developments too. As late as 1792, as we've seen, Charles Abbott observed that Belfast possessed no docks for repairing ships. And in fact, the so-called pioneer of the modern Belfast shipbuilding industry, the Scotsman William Ritchie, had arrived in the town just a year earlier. His first Belfast ship, the 300-ton Hibernia, was launched in July 1792, but it was not until 1800 that he had completed work and construction of a graving dock in Belfast. To the south of these new developments, however, Custom House Quay, Merchants Quay, and Limekiln Dock had developed over the course of the 18th century. And the earlier 17th century quays that had sat at the foot of High Street, George's Quay and an earlier Merchants Quay, have been replaced now with Hanover Quay and Chichester Quay. And if we note the position of the water on this map vis-a-vis the Chapel of Ease on High Street, we get a sense of how much this area had been transformed. As you can see, the Chapel of Ease sits back from the water quite a way up the street. If you look at earlier maps from the middle of the 17th century, the water is depicted as coming right up to the location of the church. So you get a sense of how much this area had been transformed over the course of the 18th century, and particularly in the second half of the 18th century. These developments had occurred incrementally. What appears on the 1822 map as Custom House Quay had earlier been known as Donegal Quay and had been laid out by the Belfast merchant Isaac Macartney in the early 1710s. Macartney lobbied successfully to have the custom house built on this quay, and by the 1720s he was charging his fellow merchants 2p a ton for unloading goods at his dock. By the early 1750s, the Belfast merchant John Black III, who spent most of his career in Bordeaux, was encouraging his friends in Belfast to usefully invest their riches by emulating Macartney. But it wasn't, in fact, until the late 1760s that anybody did so. At that point, another merchant, Thomas Gregg, began work on what appears on the 1822 map as Merchant's Quay, though it was originally known, confusingly, as Donegal Quay. And it was named originally Donegal Quay because news that the wife of the Earl of Donegal had given birth to a son the day before the foundation stone was laid on the quay, and in a sort of a statement which I suppose reflects the proprietorial grip, if you like, that the Donegals still held over the town in the mid-18th century. Gregg decided he'd better name his new quay after Donegal. Now, I could go on in this vein. It's possible using the topographical information from Belfast Part 1 to reconstruct the development of this quarter in granular detail. The key point I want to make, however, is that it's merchants who were principally responsible for these developments, and that Belfast's maritime quarter was, in the 18th century, fostered largely by private enterprise. Indeed, it was not until 1785 that a ballast office was established, separate from the town's corporation and given the powers to preserve and improve the port and harbour of Belfast. It was this body, known in Belfast as the Ballast Board, which would later be responsible for digging deeper channels into the Lagan and dredging out and creating new channels, particularly in the 19th century. Now, this story, what we might term the administrative history of Belfast Maritime Quarter, is not unimportant, but for the remainder of my time this afternoon, I'd like to turn to reflect more broadly on the particular character that emerged in this place. That is, to consider it not simply as a physical space, the topography of which can be traced, but as a social one, a cultural space, if you like, with a distinctive identity. The Maritime Quarter was a heavily built up area occupied by a customs house, warehouses, a rope walk, and I think it's safe to say a good number of taverns, public houses, and the occasional brothel. Although what little we know about the geography of prostitution in Georgian Belfast suggests that the town's prostitutes tended to congregate to the west of the docklands around the town's exchange building. Whatever about that, we can catch a glimpse, if you like, of the streetscape in the background of this illustration, a view of Belfast from the lough, which appeared in Ben's 1823 history of the town. The best sense, however, as to what this maritime quarter was actually like is to be found in the occasional fragmentary references to it and to those who worked in it that we can find in the Belfast newsletter. Now, I refer to those who worked in it quite intentionally because, of course, above all, this quarter was a place of work, requiring as it did the reclamation of sloblands, the construction of docks and quays required serious manual labour. So you're dealing with a quarter that at various points over the course of the 18th century would have been occupied by large numbers of workmen, as in June 1786, when the Belfast newsletter reported that there were upwards of 120 labourers employed driving piles for an embankment. But leaving aside the particular workforces that were required at times for infrastructural development, the maritime quarter would, in the usual run of things, have thronged with sailors and porters, lightermen and pilots who transported goods from the larger vessels to the shore. Occasional glimpses of this workforce appear in the columns of the newsletter. In the same issue in which it referred to the workmen driving piles in near the Long Bridge, the newsletter reported that one Ezekiel Hall, a coal porter, had been detected in giving fraudulent measure out of a vessel at our quay, and occasional references can be found to lightermen. On the 10th of December 1773, for instance, it was reported that the body of a lighterman belonging to this port was taken up drowned at Chichester Quay. In a similar vein, in December 1791, it was noted that the body of one McCulloch, a lighterman, was found in the dock some days ago. These examples of drowning are far from unique. In March 1756, it was reported that a woman disordered in mind threw herself off the quay and was drowned. In August 1761, it was reported that a boy belonging to an English vessel was drowned after falling into the water at Limekiln Dock, and 2 years later, in May 1763, it was discovered that a blind fiddler, commonly called Blind Michael, being in liquor, fell into the dock and was drowned. I could go on. There are many more examples of this in the Belfast newsletter, but the point is clear. If the maritime quarter was a place of work, it was also a place of danger. The dangers were not limited to drowning. In June 1786, it was reported that a sailor had fallen off the yard arm of a vessel and was so much hurt that his life was despaired of. We don't know whether or not he survived. And dangers of a rather different sort arose as a result of the geopolitical vicissitudes of the 18th century. When we take into account the 7 Years' War, the American War of Independence, the war with revolutionary France, it's fair to say that being at war was the normative condition for the British state in the second half of the 18th century. This created a demand for man and seaman power that could not be satisfied by normal recruitment processes, and so the grim business of naval impressment was played out at various points, and particularly during the 1770s on the quaysides of Belfast. In April 1777, the newsletter related that there had been, and I quote, a very hot press in this harbour, and we learn a considerable number of seamen were impressed. 2 years later, it was observed that there was a remarkable warm press at the quays and in the harbour. Not a sailor, even mates, were left on board any of the vessels. It is said, it was in consequence of some new instructions received from the Admiralty. What some sought to avoid, and we have references to, of sailors hiding in Belfast and deserting from ships, others saw as an opportunity. At around the same time as sailors were being impressed, notices like this were appearing in the Belfast newsletter, listing the bounties on offer for naval recruits and also the opportunities available on privateers fitting out in the port. The Amazon and Harlequin, which you can see on the slide here, offered spirited, or perhaps more accurately, desperate seamen the opportunity to make their fortunes in 1779 and 80, respectively. Now, that might all seem quaintly interesting, but ultimately insignificant. However, I would suggest that there's something more going on here. In the second half of the 18th century, as the fiscal military state was expanding, it was arguably on the docks and quaysides where naval vessels and privateers were fitting out and recruiting officers were plying their trade that it was most readily apparent and most often encountered in Belfast. And of course, it was also on the docks that the custom house was located and the town's excise officers could be found levying duties and keeping an eye, unsuccessfully if later accounts are to be believed, on the smuggling trade. Leaving aside the tendrils of the expanding 18th century state, it was also at the docks and quaysides that the informal information networks of the Atlantic world could be found. The proprietors of the Belfast newsletter were well aware of this. Benjamin Bankhurst has written of them gathering foreign information as it flowed off the quays and out of the taverns. American vessels were invariably a source of valuable news, and Belfast appears to have been the first port in Europe to receive a copy of the American Declaration of Independence. It duly appeared on the front page of the Belfast newsletter on the 27th of August, 1776. American sailors constituted a distinctive group among the town's maritime community. Their vessels were typically larger than those of native Belfast merchants, and in the late 1870s, George Benn received an intriguing account of American seamen marking the 4th of July by marching through the streets of the town in the early years of the 19th century. Alongside Americans, however, there were many others. The records of the Belfast Night Watch, established in 1812 to police what was an increasingly disordered town, contain numerous references to sailors who were often encountered drunk, sometimes in the company of prostitutes, frequently in compromising positions. Among the more noteworthy appearances is that of a Lascar, who was found on the evening of the 10th of August 1812, having been, as he said, robbed and abused in Matthew Weir's on the quay. The same evening, a report was also received of a group of Portuguese sailors, one of whom was an African, fighting with their knives on Waring Street. The reference to the African jumps out at an initial glance, but it is in fact far from remarkable. A number of other Africans or people of African origin appear in the records of the Belfast Night Watch, and as late as 1828, 2 ships crewed by enslaved men arrived in the town from the Bahamas, sparking an investigation by Belfast police magistrate Cortland Skinner. Also significant in the account, though, of the Portuguese sailors fighting with knives is that reference to them fighting. And you can picture the scene. Sailors on shore leave, drinking after weeks at sea, quarrelling and eventually brawling. Such episodes of violence were, of course, inevitable. They could, however, become very ugly. The fighting Portuguese sailors reported on in 1812 no doubt brought to mind an episode that occurred 2 years earlier in 1810, when Robert Morrison, a Belfast saddler, had been stabbed and killed by a Portuguese sailor named Anthony Silva. Where had he been stabbed and killed? At the door of a public house near one of the town's shipyards. He was arrested, tried with the help of an interpreter, and convicted and sentenced to death in August 1810. So viewed from this perspective, Belfast's dockland, its maritime quarter, takes on a very different appearance, not simply as a place of work, but as a polyglot and at times highly disordered world. Arguably, it had ever been thus. Whenever we look at maps of Belfast, we can chart very neatly what looks like an ordered streetscape and an ordered series of docks and quays. What the evidence that we encounter in the newspaper suggests is that this area was anything but orderly. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. You brought us to a very particular place after the physical space, and then entered the cultural and brought the human story out in all its forms. So we've time for a couple of questions before I hand over to Michael Potterton to close the day. We have Keith and Jonathan here. So if you'd like to raise your hand, if you've got a question for either of our speakers, please. Here, Jen.
To thank both speakers for a very interesting insight to the history of Belfast. And it strikes me the whole day has been about river towns and the resilience and almost stubbornness to hang in there, even if you're not right at the estuary, to basically expand the city, to become a city, as in the case of Belfast. I'm struck, I came across a PhD by Frank Cullen, I think of this parish, the RIA, where he did a comparative study of Dublin and Belfast as they grew, and they were both bedeviled by very shallow waters, and eventually straightening of the lough or the shipping channel seemed to make it. But I thought the insight into the colourful reality, I suppose, of what was happening down in Docklands. They were always the poorest parts of town. In fact, that whole idea about disease, malaria, the bad air, for many years had people thinking, well, you know, the reason people get sick is not because of the drinking water, it's because of what's in the air because it's foul smelling, and therefore that's where disease must come from. So I think it brings to close a very interesting day looking at river towns. And just for Jonathan, it's true that really at the end of the day, any hope of infrastructure in a city like Belfast, at the Docklands, at the maritime section, was wholly focused on whatever entrepreneurs were prepared to do, that government had no interest or was less disinclined to offer finance.
Certainly, up until the early 19th century, yes, the state doesn't have the resources to or believe that it has the obligation to provide that kind of infrastructure. And I mean, when you look even beyond Docklands, when you look at kind of the phenomenon of the 18th century improvement across Ireland, Parliament sponsor schemes, various sponsors, but ultimately we want themselves. So yeah, it's very much a private enterprise which is right. If you have a landlord with deep pockets or a desire to make the state better, you're in a good position. Belfast did not have that. It has a lot of merchant looking around and seeing anything that trying to improve themselves in the absence of kind of steering.
Anybody else over here? Think, yeah, thanks, Ian.
It's more of a comment maybe than a question, but it might be interesting to see how people respond. And it's an extension actually of the previous question. Robert McFarlane's just produced his latest book, which is on the agency of water, and in many ways, nearly all the towns talked about today in terms of rivers and seas and estuaries and tides, they're all about a triumph of topography over bathymetry. And I wonder whether people wanted to say something about the role of water and the agency of water in this story, because it's almost written out, but actually it's a constant battle. And I think with climate change and with flooding, that kind of almost struggle between topography and bathymetry is likely to be something that's going to happen more and more.
Do you want me to use it?
Yeah, please. I think it's
It's on, is it? Sorry. Yeah. I think that's a really important point. That's what really came to me when I was beginning to try and map out where medieval Belfast may have been. And there's that sort of intertidal zone, which is neither land nor water, but clearly, as we've actually just been hearing, even for later periods, is a real menace, a real challenge. And, it could be just in your mind's eye, if you take out Chichester's town for a moment, and you imagine yourself looking across the Lagan at that point, you can begin to think, this is not an easy place to traverse. And one of the things that struck me, again, looking at one of your 18th century maps, is how much you can see. I don't know if we can get it up, but there was it was the late 18th century, I think. The blue line of the Lagan was very, very striking. Then it kind of bends around where the modern Lagan bends around. But if you follow that line, sorry, it's right at the start. But if you follow that line through, then you can kind of see it does coincide with where the Belfast Castle, the later castle, was situated. So right on the edge of this sort of in-betweenness, that one there. Do you see that blue line coming up from the southeast? If you follow that through, I think, that's what we're looking at really, I think, in the sort of 16th century or before Chichester's town. And you can see how that reclamation process has really pushed into the east. So I think, you're right. It's that constant kind of interplay, entanglement. Somebody mentioned earlier on, people like these sorts of words, but entanglement between the watery world and the terrestrial, really. And that's what makes these places not only topographically interesting, but as we've just heard from Jonathan, fascinating in terms of the cultural interchange and the fluidity, the cultural tides, as well as the physical tides, which are washing up and ebbing and flowing. So yeah, it's a really important sort of reflection, I think.
I hadn't thought when I was preparing this of the agency of water, as you've phrased it there. But no, I mean, you're absolutely right that what you see in the development of Belfast is, and all towns really, is a battle with the environment, right? To kind of impose man-made structures on the landscape where you're dealing with water. What is it? Plumbers always say water finds a way. And that applies to kind of rivers and natural landscapes as much as it does to the pipes under your sink. I mean, even now, if you the image I had up at the start of the big fish overlooks the Lough and Weir, which is essentially a flood defence that's put in. This water skip has to be managed even now. It's very powerful. Although what we look at now is an incredibly man-made environment as well, in terms of how the river has been channeled and managed over the years.
Thanks. We have time for one more question. Just at the back there, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. Is there a shipwreck inventory off Belfast, or the UK government have a shipwreck inventory? Because I know the one that's been developed for the Republic is very, very impressive. I know for some work on Cork Harbour, they've kind of discovered there's probably 400 shipwrecks in Cork Harbour from different ages, and that in one sense the shipwrecks were a continuation of the port, that you just can't see them and they're just all smashed up. And has there been any kind of social history work done with dockers? I see it's a major thing now in Dublin, and there's a little bit of work kind of happening in Cork, but is there anything in Belfast on social history?
Shipwreck inventory, I don't know. I should know, but I don't. So I'm going to go off and look that up and see if there is one. Your question does remind me of a reference I came across in relation to the establishment of the Ballast Board in 1785, which is in part, or one of its responsibilities, if memory serves, is to clear wrecks. So that is part of the, I suppose what you might describe as the infrastructural management in the Georgian period. As regards kind of the social history of the kind of the dock area, there is some stuff from the 20th century. I'm an early modernist, so I haven't really looked at it. Is the answer? But Sailortown in Belfast in the 20th century has a very distinctive identity as a sort of a separate space, a separate quarter within the town, and absolutely there's a very particular kind of social history associated with that.
Yeah, I was going to mention Sailortown as well, actually. A very, very strong community heritage project based in Sailortown. And just on shipwrecks, there is the NIEA. If you look, there's a database, so it's online, Northern Ireland Environment Agency, NIEA, and it has archaeological evidence of shipwrecks. So now that's different to the historical inventory, but nevertheless, it might be a useful source to look at.
I might also point out that, given the Titanic, we don't really like to talk about shipwrecks in Belfast, so that was not a very politic question.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Some practical advice and some avenues for thought there from our speakers. So please put your hands together and say thank you very much to our speakers today. And Jonathan and Keith, you might just stay put there, and Michael Potterton is going to draw proceedings to a close.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to be very brief. What an amazing day we've had. 17 papers covering the length and breadth of the island. We've been right from the very south coast to the north coast, the east coast to the west coast, and every little river and stream and tributary in between, from Derry and Wexford, Roscommon, Westmeath, Mayo, Kerry, Waterford, Cork, Limerick, and of course then a focus, admittedly, understandably, on Dublin this afternoon, and now Belfast, I think very appropriately, and wonderful that we were able to dedicate that plenary session to the memory of our fallen colleague, Raymond Gillespie. We also had a wonderful chronological range right from the early medieval period. We had Vikings in the room. We had Anglo-Normans. We had early modernists. We looked at plantation towns, 18th and 19th century, and indeed right up to the 21st century. Ballina, how did we pronounce Ballina? How did we decide it was going to be pronounced? And the problems of flooding and climate change, as well as modern 21st century technology and approaches to looking at the past in different ways. And in terms of the sources that were used, we have from the antiquarian maps and old photographic collections, government records, correspondence and guidebooks, architecture, place names, of course, and the importance of toponymy, archaeology, excavations, and maps, lots and lots of maps. And of course, crucially to that, we've got the Irish Historic Towns Atlas. And it's always wonderful to see without any prompting whatsoever that our speakers today and at all our seminars use the maps, look at the maps from the various Atlas publications. In terms of themes, of course, well, water was everywhere. Water was everywhere. And we looked at the challenges of water, flooding, erosion, the fact that it brought your enemy to your doorstep, issues with disease and pollution, as well as the opportunities, fishing, transport, industry, defense, etc., etc. And as Ronan mentioned there as well, dealing with the actual water and the challenge that water will find a way, as your plumber will tell you. Really, it just remains for me to say some thank yous. We began this morning with the President of the Royal Irish Academy, Professor Pat Gyrey, and the CEO of the Heritage Council, Virginia Tehan, as well as the manager of the Irish Walls Towns Network, Emer O'Connell. And it's wonderful that we have such an interdisciplinary, a transdisciplinary, and an interinstitutional subject area and theme, and bringing all of those people and all of those bodies together is really wonderful. And of course, none of this would happen without the organisers, and in particular, on behalf of the board of the IHTA, we would like to thank Sarah Gearty and Jennifer Moore, who have made today operate very, very smoothly indeed. I'm sure there were all sorts of technical issues and things going on in the background that we weren't aware of. But in terms of the organisation and the work that they in particular have put in, as well as Rachel and Afric and my colleagues Jonathan and Ruth, thank you very much indeed. Penultimately, I'd like to thank the speakers and the chairs, the people who spoke from the podium today, the contribution that they made. So thank you, the last remaining standing up here or sitting up here, as well as those who have gone before us. I think you'll agree that it was a really splendid array of papers. But finally then, just to thank you, particularly the ones who have stuck it out right till the very end. We must be nearly on time just now, but thank you very much for coming along. Many of you are repeat offenders. You come to this seminar every year, come hell or high water. Oh, sorry about that. And on that subject, next year we propose to run our seminar on a similar or the same theme of water generally and water and topography, looking at the international context of that. So please keep the time in your diary. We'll let you know nearer the time exactly where it will be, when it will be. You know where it will be, and we'll be sending out a call for papers in due course. So thank you very much indeed to all the organisers, all the speakers, and you. Now it's time to go, maybe for some refreshments across the road, and look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you very much. Bye.